It's James from 3 Pedal Special, and boy, do I have a story for you.
And with an eye to the future, tomorrow begins today. Nintendo, the world's leader in video games, has joined forces with Silicon Graphics, the world's leader in visual computing, to introduce the most exhilarating, breathtakingly realistic 3D video entertainment ever witnessed. Project Reality. Leagues beyond any currently available or anticipated hardware, Project Reality will bring to home video players the same types of astounding visual effects seen in movies, like Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park. When this technology is made interactive, players won't just watch their TV screens, they'll dive headfirst right through them.
All the classic gaming nerds out there will love this story. So this has to do with gaming in the early to mid-90s, and it was a really big deal. It's a general consensus for most that gaming in the mid to late 90s was pretty phenomenal. The transition into 3D graphics kind of allowed games to be more realistic and immersive, as well as be more attractive to non-gamers. It really showed people who weren't much of gamers before what was possible in a video game, and would give them a chance to try it out. But rarely do people ever ask why gaming was so good at this time. And I mean, let's be honest, a lot of the systems at this time, while they had 3D graphics, they were a bit awkward, and they had their own little quirks that made them different, but also a little hard to deal with sometimes. For example, the N64 had some serious development challenges that caused games to have shorter draw distances, require clever texture work, have scratchy sounding audio, but nonetheless, amazing games were still produced and developed, and then therefore enjoyed by everybody. The limitations in the PS1 with hardware for 3D graphics and computational power, and the insane load times that would come from the idea of using CDs and an optical drive in the PS1 certainly caused some annoyance as well. 3D models were sometimes frustratingly unpolished and overall did not really work as well. But regardless, these games were still amazing on both platforms. Despite developmental challenges, limitations, and other roadblocks, games for the PS1 and N64 were pumped out in insane cadences, sometimes in the case of 6 months. Think about that. A game from start to finish in 6 months. What other consumer product that requires code can be done that quickly? I certainly can't think of anything. N64 and PS1 developers, we as gamers are forever grateful for you. I believe the reasons these games were so great and that they were developed at such a quick cadence was partly due to the insane competition between Sony and Nintendo. This all stemmed from a partnership that went horribly wrong. Sony and Nintendo had decided to work out terms on a partnership in the early 90s to deliver a console that would be a baby of both technologies that they had pushed. In the late 80s, Sony kind of saw this enormous success that the Super Nintendo had done, and they wanted a piece of that video game pie. So the Super NES CD-ROM was this realization, but unfortunately it would never be released. The partnership was originally healthy and somewhat logical at the time for both parties. They both wanted to create something that was fun, family-friendly, and use CD-ROM technology. However, things started to take a turn for the worst after some disagreements began happening inside the development circles between the two companies. Sony started to push the idea more of marketing towards adults, while Nintendo wanted to stay family-friendly, and Sony decided to push more CD-ROMs, while Nintendo continued to stand their ground and fight for the future of the video game cartridge. After about 300 or so prototypes on the Super NES CD-ROM, it was decided that it would not be released. Nintendo was really fed up with what Sony had been pushing, and also historically had been extremely aggressive at pursuing licensing deals, making partnerships. So this made them get in the talks with Philips about potentially being their new partner, and at this point things went haywire. The two split rather angrily and decided to go their own separate ways. Sony was left to develop their own gaming machine in the dark with zero video game experience, no gaming studios. They were pretty much way over their heads. On the other hand, Nintendo was sitting pretty and they had the freedom to do what they wanted now. So this was in the early 90s. Now let's fast forward to 1996 when the N64 and PS1 had been released and everyone was enjoying the games released for both of them. It was a fantastic time in video game history. However, the feud between the two companies was still quite ripe, and this led to some interesting stories. Now let's fast forward to today. Today I found this story on an eBay listing. This eBay listing was of a sign, and so this is kind of where this fits into the mold. So there was a sign for sale on eBay for $10,000, and this sign was a Toys R Us display that was usually used to be hung from the ceiling, so it was kind of like a projection down. Now, it was double-sided, and unfortunately, Toys R Us seemed to, I guess, neglect the fact that Nintendo and PlayStation didn't really like themselves very well. So what they decided to do was take one sign. On one side, have a Nintendo 64 officially licensed logo on it, and then the other side have a PS1 officially licensed logo. So, yeah, that probably wasn't the best idea. Long story short, a Nintendo representative who brought some of the promotional items over there saw this sign and reported it back to Nintendo's headquarters. Things didn't go well after that. I'm going to read the description the seller had put into the eBay listing, almost word for word. It kind of has poor grammar, so I'll interpret some of it. I'm not sure how real this story is because it's from an eBay listing, but if it isn't real, I'd be very disappointed. This is a pretty cool story nonetheless. Okay, so it says, "This is the rarest N64 sign ever made. The sign is more than a rare, I thought it was a myth. Everyone has heard the story of the Nintendo-Sony romance before their horrible breakup, as I just explained. Everyone is also aware of the bad blood between the two ever since. But there is a nice cliff note to this story that most people don't know. I first heard the story about 15 years ago. After the breakup, Sony were left with all the disc technology, which became the basis for the original PlayStation. Nintendo developed the next generation cartridge system for N64, but Nintendo was crippled by Sony. Nintendo would not venture into disc technology for almost another decade. Sony would be soon the crowned king of consoles for the next decade. Nintendo has never forgiven Sony. Well, not everyone knew about this spat between the two companies. First and foremost was Toys R Us, and at the time, Toys R Us was the biggest retailer in America, which was from 90 to 97. The executives at Toys R Us didn't pay attention or didn't care about the tension between these feuding companies. They sold toys, and that's all they care about. Well, that would all change. Nintendo has reps that deliver their promo items and some kiosks and almost all their signs directly to the stores. Places like EB Games, GameStop, Toys R Us, etc. They're responsible for delivering their promo items and making sure all the display items are in order in each store. Well, in the case of large department stores like Toys R Us, they were given leadway to buy and order their own signs from the manufacturer using the official Nintendo license. The reason being is they used very large light-up signs that would hang from the ceiling, so it would be hard to ship. So Toys R Us, being cheap and not realizing that two companies were feuding, made a huge mistake. They placed the logo of the N64 on one side and the Sony PlayStation logo on the other side, both licensed, by the way, because the two sections were right by each other. An alert Nintendo rep noticed the sign in the store and alerted Nintendo of America. Nintendo went ballistic. This was the last time the two officially licensed logos would ever appear together. Nintendo demanded that Toys R Us take down the signs. Toys R Us initially refused, saying that the signs didn't violate their licensing agreement. But Nintendo threatened to sue, and of course the signs were taken down and replaced with the typical double-sided N64 light-up signs. I heard this story a few times over the years when talking about extremely rare N64 collectibles, but I honestly thought it was a myth. I've seen over 100 major N64 collections, and I've never seen one in my life. I've also asked very knowledgeable N64 collectors about it, and almost all of them had never even heard of this story. And the few that had heard of the story, only one person had said he'd seen one, and I honestly thought he was lying until I met the grandson of a former Toys R Us manager. Since the sign was not going to be hung, his granddad took the sign home against corporate orders to destroy it, and it's been sitting in the basement for over 20 years. He did not take the bracketing that would have been held to the side of the ceiling, but he did store it in such a manner that the sign is mint to near mint and still has the cellophane protected over the PlayStation side. Well, if you have any questions, feel free to ask, and I will respond ASAP. I will entertain any reasonable offer. So this story seems a little suspect in a few scenarios. It kind of contradicted itself. It says the Nintendo store rep saw it hanging in there, but then it wasn't ever hung. Looking past that, this is a pretty sweet story. Think about this. If this is true, the fact that Nintendo went out of their way, and they went, according to this story, ballistic, to have Toys R Us completely get rid of all these signs, pretty astounding. And I don't really remember off the top of my head if I ever saw signs like this hung up anywhere, but it would be kind of hard for Nintendo to track down every double-sided sign that's officially licensed and take it down, don't you think? Food for thought. Anyway, I thought you guys would enjoy this story. I certainly did. I thought it was really fascinating. Even if it's not true, it's still cool. Well, that's it for me for this video. Thanks for stopping by. Hi, I'm James from 3 Pedal Special. Thanks for watching my video. There will be more videos like this in the future, so if you could, please like, comment, and subscribe. I'd love to hear from the community. Who knows? You might like what I have to offer. Thanks.